We're going to dig into some news, and we're starting with politics. Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden is heading to Kenosha, Wisconsin today, just days after President Trump's own visit to that city. Kenosha's mayor had asked both candidates to hold off on their trips in the wake of the police shooting of Jacob Blake. Ed O'Keefe is standing by for us from Wilmington, Delaware, to talk a little bit more about this. So we're hearing that the former vice president is actually scheduled to meet with Jacob Blake's family today. The president did not do that, and one of the things that he said was that the family wanted to meet with their lawyer present, and he didn't think, I think the president said that was appropriate. But what can you tell us about the meeting that's planned with the Bidens?
Well, we don't know much about the actual meeting that Mr. Biden and his wife, Dr. Jill Biden, will have with the Blake family. The campaign has not released that information. What we do know is that around 3 p.m. Eastern Time, Biden will hold a separate meeting with community leaders to talk about what went on in regards to the shooting of Jacob Blake and the response to it, and about violence in that city and across the country generally. That portion of his trip today is public, and we'll be able to see parts of it or all of it. But we don't know where, when, with whom exactly Biden's are meeting with later in the afternoon. This is Biden's first trip to Wisconsin in, I believe, more than 600 days at this point. It's about his 21st trip anywhere outside of his hometown, Wilmington, Delaware, since the pandemic began. But this is a critical one for him because he's going right into a swing state where he was expected to spend considerable time last month for the Democratic convention, and of course they had to postpone that because of the pandemic. So one of the longer trips he has taken since this pandemic began. But again, details on what exactly will happen with that visit are still pretty close hold. We've been asking since last night, and they haven't told us much.
So we pointed out that the mayor of Kenosha had asked both candidates not to come. He felt it would be too much of a distraction, and he made that plea just around the time that Kenosha had finally, the protests had finally sort of simmered down. So Biden was asked about the trip, why he's choosing to go to Kenosha. I want to play some of that sound.
We got to heal. We got to put things together, bring people together. And so my purpose in going will be to do just that, to be a positive influence on what's going on, talk about what need be done, and try to see if there's a beginning of a mechanism to bring the folks together. We have to heal. This is about making sure that we move forward.
So the former vice president also said that he had received requests from Kenosha to come and visit. Do we know how officials are sort of taking his visit, how it's being received?
Well, as he said, the mayor is probably the best example. Doesn't want people coming because, I mean, for one thing, it's a security drain for his city, undoubtedly. And Biden said he had spoken with state leaders as well as some local leaders about encouraging him to come. And, you know, in the roughly 18 hours since he made this announcement yesterday, we haven't seen too much of a negative reaction to his decision to come. I think by the time the president announced he was going, it was always assumed that Biden was going to make some kind of a trip, a similar trip, by at least early next week. So here we do it today, and we'll see how this goes. But look, you know, we haven't seen these two candidates inject themselves into too many of these current events, as might traditionally be the case in a pre-pandemic presidential contest, where you might see the candidates go to meet with people or to sort of dwell on some kind of an event. And I think for Biden, this is a potential opportunity for him to exhibit one of the characteristics that traditionally a president holds, and that is the idea of sort of the comforter-in-chief or the healer-in-chief, the kind of person that can try to bring people together. The argument, of course, Biden has made since he launched his campaign is that the current president is incapable of doing that. And so Biden is trying to provide today a strong contrast. And if, you know, at the end of the day, that meeting with community leaders goes well, the meeting with the Blake family is well received by them and by the community overall, then perhaps Biden will have proven his point that he can inject himself into tinderbox situations, whereas the president cannot.
Yeah, and he also said something yesterday that the president has not. He said that he believes that the officers involved in the shootings of Jacob Blake and Breonna Taylor, that they should face charges. Very different messaging. You know, the sound that we heard from him just before this was about, you know, the need for healing and coming together. The president's message had to do with law and order, and I presume that you can bring stability to these cities through law and order. Can we talk a little bit about the different messages that we're getting from these two candidates when it comes to this topic?
Sure. For one thing, the president is using his advertising budget to raise concerns about Joe Biden's ability to control the violence or respond to it across the country. There's an ad running in Wisconsin and many other battleground states right now that dwells on the idea that he is weak or unsupportive of law enforcement across the country. That's trying to do two things. One, whip up concern and support among the president's base voters, but two, also try to pick away at an element of Biden's record that he's been pretty strong on in the past, up until perhaps this point, at least in terms of public awareness, and that is law enforcement. This is somebody who worked with police agencies, with federal agencies in the 90s to enact the big crime bill that, of course, has become such a subject of hot debate and concern in the wake of all of these shootings. Somebody who had worked to increase funding for police agencies across the country, but of course has seen that all thrown into doubt and into debate, given that the times are different and that he has adopted more of the concern and the position of many other Democrats, which is that, look, there has to be greater accountability for police officers in this country, and that a lot of the policies that were put in place over the last 25 years also need to be rethought. He was asked the question about Blake yesterday, in part because his running mate, Kamala Harris, had gone a little further in saying that, the officers that had shot Blake definitely should be charged. His answer was sort of designed to say, look, let's let the justice system run its course, but clearly something has to happen with these guys, given the video evidence at least. And then he expanded and said, but also the cops involved with Breonna Taylor's shooting, the people who've been causing violence in the streets of Portland, Oregon, all of them, through the justice system, have to be held accountable. So it's taking sort of a more patient wait-and-see approach, but making clear that he believes, based on what's out there already, somebody's got to face consequences.
So listen, Ed, before I let you go, got to ask you about an announcement from Facebook. It's changing its policy when it comes to political ads. I think, Mark Zuckerberg, compared to maybe some of the other big tech CEOs, has taken a particular approach with the president. It appears that he's been trying to sort of have a closer relationship with the president and make sure that he has his ear. So this decision, I'm sure, is going to maybe upset a few people, but can we talk about what Facebook says it will do moving forward?
Yeah, the big announcement today, or part of it, is that they are promoting or beginning to more aggressively share information with its users about where exactly they can vote, how they can vote, and then trying to remind users, both in messages they'll put up and preventatively, if they see information that sort of runs in the face of this, that we may ultimately not know the result of the election on election night, and that the gradual counting of ballots, if it takes weeks or days, is not necessarily a sign of an illegitimate or fraudulent election. It's an example of, the process running its course and responding to increased demand for absentee ballots because of the pandemic. As he told Gayle King in an interview this morning, in part, quote, let me just pull it up here, he said, "There's nothing illegitimate about taking a few extra days or even weeks in order to make sure that all the votes get counted. In fact, it would be illegitimate if we didn't make sure that all of the valid votes were counted." That's a totally fair and valid point. And he's saying that news organizations like us and everyone else should be reminding viewers of that, readers of that, listeners of that this could take a little while, that we're going to have a little more patience, as we have to with everything else. And so it's a perfectly valid point that bears repeating. Election day may turn into election days, could turn into election weeks, potentially could turn into election months, but it's all designed to make sure that everybody's vote is counted and counted accurately. In the case of the president and others, what he said is that we're going to try to make sure that if people are spreading disinformation, we're going to call it out, we're going to slap something on it and say that this is incorrect. And he said they're no longer going to accept new political advertising in the week before the election. That doesn't stop political advertising on the platform up until election day, but it won't allow a campaign to swoop in the last week and buy more space. Some TV stations, some radio stations have taken a policy through the years of not running political ads a few days before the election or on election day itself. So this is kind of similar to that, except that he's not accepting any new business.
Yeah, and and kind of that's sort of leaving a lot of money on the table. Usually that last week is where you could really see a flood of advertising dollars. So at least Facebook is sort of putting their money where their mouth is, because they've had a really hard time handling misinformation, particularly when it's connected to political ads. So Ed, thank you so much.
Take care.